feel free to, tell as many stories and prompt to as many things as you want.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. Here we go. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm here for episode 8 with Lennox Kalifungwa. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackson. It's great to be here today.
This should be fun.
Appreciate you inviting me on here.
Yeah.
I was wondering when this would happen,
Yes.
So,
well, I appreciate you inviting me to your lovely house, and you've got
of
an
course.
incredible scenic view everywhere, which is fantastic and something you get a lot of in Africa, I'm sure. So you're a journalist, content creator, marketing specialist, all sorts of other things. Do you mind going through the list?
Yeah, sure. I like to think of myself as a communicator.
Okay.
Just in general. I suppose I've had the opportunities to build my trade and skill in just communicating, whether that's through writing or speaking, design, all kinds of things. And through that, I get to speak quite a little bit on a variety of subjects. I'm involved in, I guess, what you could call cultural apologetics to some degree. And I write quite a bit in the world of marketing as well. You've mentioned content creation. So, that's all of it. Of course, I'm a husband as well.
Yeah.
Got 3 kids.
More important.
Absolutely. I absolutely consider that an actual vocation as well. Like, actually leading a family and
100%.
Raising kids, loving my wife. It's great. It's a great privilege.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how long have you been in Zambia? Because you weren't always here, correct?
Yes. At this point, it kind of feels like it's sort of split down the middle.
Okay.
Although, at this point, I've probably been in Zambia a little bit longer. So I've been here for a long time, but I grew up in South Africa.
Okay.
In Pretoria, South Africa. Very, very interesting way to grow up. My family and I had moved out to South Africa just a few years after the apartheid government had crumbled.
Yeah.
And, my father was called to pastor an all-white church at the time.
Okay.
So that was, tension
That's an
was still,
experience.
it was still interesting. But it was an experience. But it was an excellent experience. We were part of a wonderful church there, where we've made lifelong friends.
Right.
And I suppose that's the environment I grew up in. And then somewhere in my mid-teens, my dad had an opportunity to come to Zambia and pastor a church here.
Right.
I suppose his big goal was to see how he could help his home country, Zambia, understand what a Christian worldview is,
right,
and begin to sort of build towards that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was his big goal coming there. So anyway, I suppose that might explain this very confused accent of mine that I can't absolutely define. I can't tell you what this is,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've been here in Zambia, and then how long have you been doing the kind of content creation, marketing extraordinaire kind of?
Yeah. In some ways, I could sort of go back 12 years.
Okay.
So,
a long time.
Yeah. I remember I was still in college when I started doing, voiceovers and radio shows, and at the time I was involved in with music. So this has kind of been my world for a while. And when I started it, I didn't really have this big goal in mind necessarily. It's just I just really enjoy doing those kinds of things. It's fun.
Yeah.
Did quite a bit of writing back then as well. And over the years, that developed and became a lot more serious. So, and I think even just finding my voice over time in terms of what are the kinds of things that I care to communicate about. What is it that I actually want to say? What kind of content do I want to create? Yeah. It's been interesting to just kind of see how that journey's unfolded over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's been about a 12-year journey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. And then, so as far as content goes across the world, I feel like we've kind of seen a shift in the past couple years from content that's more, put it on your TV, you go watch a movie either in the cinemas or at home. Mm-hmm. But now we've moved away from that into more of an individualistic consummation of
Yes.
content. So,
Yes.
TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all these social media apps. First, do you think that's a good shift?
Yeah.
Do you think that's a healthy shift? And if not, how do we get back to the olden days, back to
Sure.
going to the cinema with your family, like watching content was a family experience. How do we kind of get back to that?
Yeah, man. I mean, there's much to say there. I mean, the first thing I'll say is the development of some of this new technology has been good, generally speaking. I mean, it gives even us as Christians an opportunity to reach more people.
Yeah.
To have more platforms to publish all kinds of content as well.
Right.
I firmly believe that social media, for example, is one of the ways that Christendom might advance as well.
Yeah.
I absolutely see that. But at the same time, I also definitely see the danger of modernity in all of it.
Right.
In that it seems to me that social media has sort of changed the way people live their lives. It's
Yeah.
like people live their lives around social media.
Right.
It governs almost everything.
Yeah.
It could even govern what you order at a restaurant.
Right.
Because if it
Yeah.
doesn't look good on the gram, then
Yes.
what's the point of
then why order it?
And why order?
You're not here to
you
eat.
know?
You're here to get followers.
Yeah. And so for sure there's pitfalls to all of it.
Yeah.
But sometimes I also wonder if there's a level of excellence that's diminished
Yeah.
with just the constant supply of content.
Right.
I guess it's a very competitive world for that reason, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure to what degree we're actually hearing or listening to or watching better stories.
Right.
Through whether it's movies, whether it's
Yeah.
you name it, like
Right.
whatever kind of
Yeah,
media. I'm not sure if we're still getting that sort of quality. I mean, for sure the technology is developing. We're seeing more people do interesting things with cameras and all that kind
Right.
of stuff.
Yeah.
But in terms of just the time to really tell a story and
Yeah.
for people to really appreciate a story.
Yeah.
And I think that's also something that consumers of content have
driven.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But then also, in this world where there's like shorter attention spans and like it's harder to tell a layered story.
Yes.
That people are actually going to pay
Yes.
attention to
Yes, it
before they
is.
move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely challenges there. In terms of, I mean, you asked how do we get back? I wouldn't say the goal should be to necessarily go back to the old days necessarily.
Okay.
But more so to move forward towards figuring out how best, firstly, we can glorify God and serve our neighbor best.
Yeah.
Like that's the principle that should
Right.
guide everything that we do.
Yeah.
And I suppose one way to do it is to, as Christians, just provide the kind of content that's full of quality.
Yeah.
And in a sense, not be so carried away by the trends of the culture as well.
Right.
Creating content that I think is also a lot more communal at a family level, especially.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be very crucial.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the content, as you might have mentioned, is just it's driven by a lot of individualism.
Yeah.
It's me and my phone.
Right.
It's
Right.
With like this full sense of connection through social media.
Yeah.
But at the expense of real relationships being formed.
Right.
And so I think if we can create the sort of content that will actually enable real connections and real relationships to develop and grow, I think that's one way to solve that. So perhaps less quantity, more quality,
More quality.
And sort of creating a new culture around entertainment and content creation. I think that's how we have to be thinking.
No, that's it. it's true, and there's a lot of interesting points in what you just said. I mean, some of the most viewed pieces of short form content, TikToks or YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, they are just like, it feels like someone filmed it on an iPhone in their backyard.
Right.
And it's not like the masterpieces that take years of hard work and diligence, and creativity and curiosity, to create. And I think returning to that, the other thing you mentioned was talking about the individualistic. You've got YouTube, you got these things. Part of it is, a lot of these people are much they're going to use dirty langue. They're they're not going to have some of the things on screen are going to be maybe risque. And that's not something that you'd feel comfortable watching with your family. And so it's kind of driven oddly a more like, okay, I'm just going to watch this myself, because I'm not too offended by it. Which is odd, but I would say some of the greatest story, I don't know if you've seen them, but the Guy Ritchie films, some of his movies, just excellent storytelling, excellent cinematography. That's the kind of thing that I think we should be striving more towards. Not the, I would actually say, going against the just Mr. Beast, entertain. You have to, life isn't just one long piece of entertainment, or at least not usually. Sometimes it can be, but as a general rule, it's not. So having the ability to have those quieter, more intense moments, I think, is something that we need to return to.
Agreed. And I mean, just as you're speaking, the idea of how art and entertainment reveal much about what a culture actually values. Is what comes to mind. I think it's Francis Schaeffer who really documented this well. And it shows you that the selfism is a very big thing. It's one of the idols in the culture. We live in this just pleasure-seeking, pleasure-driven culture, and that seems to govern how almost everything is done. And that kind of goes back to something I said just a moment ago about us actually creating an entirely different culture around entertainment. In order to do that, I think we'd have to be the sort of people who actually have different values and beliefs. Like it actually does have to begin with us reorienting our worship towards God. And letting that then drive everything. Because then the quality, the quantity, and the actual content. Those are the kinds of things I think we need to be very serious about exercising dominion over, but in a way that ultimately, again, glorifies God, in a way that also seeks the highest good of those who are creating that content for.
And then towards that end, you mentioned that Christians, we should be doing it differently because we've got a different set of values. What does that kind of look like played out? Because there's obviously like the movies that's The Chosen, and all those somewhat awful Christian movies. But how do you? But those, I think, are as Martin Luther once said, a Christian shoemaker doesn't show he's a Christian by putting all the little crosses on his shoes, but by making good shoes. Right. So how do we go forward, shining Christ's light in our content, but not like explicitly?
That's good. Kind of going back to something that people often talk about in other fields of life, but I think this should also apply to the world of content creation. But the whole matrix of truth, beauty, and goodness. We ought to be the kinds of people who create content that is true, right? It's a reflection of truth. It's anchored in the worship of God.
Of the truth.
Yes, and then beauty. I think that pertains to doing things with excellence and aesthetics. And in fact, on that point, I think where a lot of Christians have been lacking is, a sense of imagination. A sense of awe and wonder. A sense of adventure. And the ability to communicate that in a way that is just so compelling. You think of You think of a C.S. Lewis, for example,
Right.
the Chronicles of Narnia,
Yeah.
and his ability to just tell a really good story.
Yeah.
Again, like I think when we generally as Christians, when we think of content creation, we're thinking of how we can slap as many verses
Right.
on something as possible.
Yeah.
And there's a place for that.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that we need to recover a sense of wonder, a sense of imagination in the content that we create. And then, of course, I think goodness, would pertain, again, to seeing or pursuing the highest good of those that we're seeking to engage with in that content. And seeking to be fruitful with everything that we put out. And so I think that's where it's got to begin. I think we have to challenge ourselves
Right.
to one, just do really good work.
Yeah.
I think we kind of Christian culture in general, we tend to think that because we have the truth, we don't really have to care about the beauty part as much.
No.
Yes. It's just what we say matters more than how we say it. And,
Yep.
In fact, how we say it doesn't matter at all, and that's sometimes how it comes across.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that we need to pay a lot more attention to. Is just actually striving to be pioneers.
Yeah.
Of excellence.
Yeah.
Even as we go about creating content.
Yeah, no, it's true. Back at my high school, our motto was gratitude, sacrifice, and excellence.
Love it.
And that's the kind of thing that our content should be.
I love
it. That's what will drive this awe and wonder of Christians. How are they doing that? How are they creating such such pieces of art that are glorious?
Yes.
And that's the kind of thing that
pieces of art that are glorious.
Yeah.
The kind of art that even the pagans won't fail to recognize.
Yeah.
As
will
being
stand in wonder.
Exactly.
Right.
They too
Yeah.
can marvel at this piece of work.
Right.
That just screams awe. Wonder,
yeah.
glory.
It just screams there is an ultimate truth. There is an ultimate
truth.
beauty.
Absolutely.
And we're trying to get there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
And in that vein, I was talking to Dane Wilson and Matt Vane on one of my previous episodes. And we were talking about the shift from horizontal videos. Most people now film in vertical.
Sure.
Which is very odd.
Yeah.
Dane was saying that horizontal, he would like everything to return to horizontal.
Absolutely.
Not everything, but most things to return to horizontal. Sure. And Matt was saying that vertical is a much better form. I believe that's correct. He'll probably correct me at some point. But but what are your kind of thoughts on that transition we've seen from horizontal to vertical?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I guess both of them you could definitely say have a place.
Yeah.
There is something about horizontal that I think tends to capture reality that much better. Tends to be more of an immersive experience in that sense too. It gives you a sense of context.
Yeah.
That I think vertical tends to miss. I tend to find that vertical tends to drive a more individualistic sort of engagement.
Right. Yeah.
As opposed to something that can actually
be shared.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of those. It seems like one of those like really small technical things.
Right.
But I think that it potentially does communicate something even about what people value.
Yeah.
In that sense. Vertical as well, if you really think about it, is like content built for phones.
Oh yeah,
right.
100%. 100%.
Like that's what it's about. Which again, a phone is a great tool.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things are great tools. But there's a way in which I think even the artistry of content, I think, dies with the vertical approach a little bit. I want to say it's a personal preference, but generally speaking, I would love to see us go back to a more horizontal approach.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think the horizontal it's true. It's more how we see the world.
Yeah.
But it's also it's kind of vertical. It takes you out of it.
Yeah.
It's like I'm watching now. I'm watching something.
Yes.
Whereas when most, you're in a cinema and you're watching some movie.
Yes.
You're in the movie.
Absolutely.
You're not watching it. You're part
go.
of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and yes, I'd love to see a return to that, but
Absolutely.
with the rise of social media, that is trickier.
Yeah, it is tricky.
It is trickier.
It certainly is.
Yeah. So you moved to Zambia. Content creation here, I would assume, is less of a thing, even than in South Africa, but definitely less of a thing than in the States.
Right.
Do you see kind of a rise of content creators and a rise of filmmakers, things like that, in Zambia?
Yeah, certainly. I think I've seen that grow quite rapidly over the last few years. It's definitely not the level, as you're saying, as, for example, South Africa or the US.
Yeah.
But it's growing as technology begins or continues to develop. You see a lot more people who have access to smartphones, and all of a sudden it gives them the opportunity to be content creators.
Right.
You see people rising to do that. Filmmaking as well is definitely growing in this country as well.
Yeah.
In many ways it is still in its infancy. It's not yet, I think, at a level that would compete with world-class content in its production, but there are people who are working hard to get there.
Yeah.
And so it's a very, I'd say, new sort of thing here that is taking off, but with a lot more room to grow.
Yeah.
I think just generally media and entertainment is becoming just a much bigger thing in this part of the world.
And that's because of the rise of technology?
And that's the rise of technology. Yeah,
interesting.
absolutely.
Yeah. And do you think it should become bigger? Do you think that's a good thing as a general rule? Or, because obviously I think in the US there are probably too many influencers, as they would call themselves. But how do you kind of stop Zambia from going over that edge?
Yeah. The way you do that is to get Christians to lead the whole movement. All right. We have our work cut out for us in that regard.
Yeah, we definitely do.
Is it a good thing? I think it could be. It really could be.
Yeah.
Just historically, two of the ways that people generally take over a culture is through education and media.
Yes.
And so I think we certainly have an opportunity to influence people through content creation. And Zambia, that's just ripe for the molding. The median age in Zambia is 17 years old,
which is wild.
That's crazy, right?
And that's a great thing. Demographically.
It's a great thing demographically. Like that there's so much opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think that if we're not utilizing social media to engage with this demographic, someone else will.
Yes.
and we're gonna lose out in a big way there.
Yeah.
And so I do think that it provides a great opportunity to again spread truth, beauty, and goodness far and wide, and to really leave those impressions in the minds and hearts of young Zambians.
Yeah, because TikTok here is a huge thing.
Right.
Yeah, much bigger than I thought it would be.
Sure.
It's kind of big all across the world, but here everyone has it. Shocked faces when I was like, I don't have TikTok.
Right.
And they're like, what? What do you do with your time?
If it makes you feel any better, I don't have TikTok either.
Yeah. First, I don't want the Chinese spying on me, and it's also a waste of time. But
Absolutely.
Anyway, in the U.S. though, and in much of the West, being the TikTok influencer, the Instagram personality is kind of idealized. Oddly, we've kind of seen the U.S. is kind of running into a problem now where we need more electricians and plumbers and blue collar jobs because everyone's too focused on how many followers do I have on Instagram. How do we as in Zambia specifically, as it's growing and as it continues to grow as it should, how do we kind of maintain the primary focus of employment on the infrastructure and the building of this country?
That's good. I think this is layered in the sense that I think that a lot of that formation in terms of how people think about things has to be formed in a church,
Okay.
and I think through education as well.
Yeah.
Like, teach them right.
Right.
And I think that's going to go a long way. And I think just teaching people, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to this. I mean, just as you mentioned, it seems like we live in this world that everyone's like trying to chase a platform
Yeah.
of sorts. And
Yeah.
social media gives everyone this ability or potential to be like a leader of sorts.
Right.
Right? Like
To be listened to.
exactly, to be listened to, with no checks for credibility,
Right.
and that sort of thing. And I think that one of the ways to do it is really to build the kinds of institutions, and I think church is definitely one of them. Family is one of them. The hospitality, even around a home, is one way to do this. Is give people a sense of community that they wouldn't get on social media.
Right.
Because the truth is, even on social media, people actually are starving.
Yeah.
For community.
Right.
They're depressed. Like
Yeah.
all the data will show you that.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to start to build alternatives to that, give people a sense of community. And when you have a sense of community, you now have a platform where people can learn to humbly serve each other.
Right.
Which I think then goes a long way in learning to appreciate other vocations. Like, okay, well, Jackson needed his faucet fixed, and so I'm gonna go help him do that.
Right.
He needed his, and that way we're also developing skills that are tangible and in a way that can really serve the needs of our friends and our neighbors around us as well.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen when people aren't being plugged into real communities.
They're physical and church and other communities. I have something to add on that, but I'm going to restart the camera real quick.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very interesting that as you were saying, they are, many social media influencers are very starved for community. But I also think that you were saying, how can think about how you can serve people. This is something my dad is big on. But I think there's a shift that's happened from like what I'm doing with my time and my work and my life is I'm serving other people, right? You're an electrician. You're there to help other people live their life.
Yes.
To kind of a what makes me happy.
Absolutely.
Which is, I think, where we've seen this rise of social media stars, as it were. And the trick is then, how do we get back to you're in one sense you're there to help other people.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
It's a tricky transition.
It kind of goes back to really trying to instill an entirely different set of values that people hold to today.
Right.
Teaching them the value. Well, really, it's trying to instill virtue in people.
Yeah.
Teaching them the value of humility and service. And teaching them the importance of recognizing a need, and teaching them the importance of assuming personal responsibility,
right,
to meet those needs. And I think when we can get that right, even the way we harness something like social media changes entirely. So
no, that's interesting. On kind of shifting to a different note, your father moved you and your family here many years ago. He obviously had a very instilled mission, not only for himself, but actually like an idea for what he thought Zambia could become.
Sure.
And he clearly instilled that in you and your brother. Your brother works at the college at the School of Divinity, and you're here also working with them and doing all sorts of other things. What kind of was that mission?
Right. So really the mission was to give people a Christian worldview that would enable them to really, I'd say, develop Christendom around them, to really enable Zambia to attain the freedoms it needs to flourish in a way that ultimately glorifies God.
Right.
And the way that my dad had initially thought about doing this was really just instilling a new way of thinking in people, helping them think from a biblical perspective. The Zambian landscape is interesting. Again, we've talked about a young demographic as well.
Yeah.
But in relation to the church, specifically from like a reformed perspective, the reform movement in Zambia is just shy of 40 years.
Okay.
And so in many ways, it's very much in its infancy.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
It's still new.
It's still new. And I think one of the amazing things about this is that most people have a decent understanding and appreciation for a reformed soteriology, but that hasn't really spread into many other areas of life just yet. People don't reckon with the Bible's relevance in the world of economics, in the world of business, in the world of law, and the world of sport.
Right.
You name it. And so I think the goal and the mission was really to just help people become acquainted with some of these ideas.
Yeah.
And teach them what it means to really live all of life for the glory of Christ.
Yeah.
That's really the goal.
Yeah.
That's really the mission.
Because Zambia, I saw in a poll, or not a poll, a study that happened last year, Romania was the most Christian, identifiably Christian,
Right.
Nominally Christian nation. Zambia was second.
Right.
But you're right in that there's not a thinking as a Christian. I've come across that actually quite a bit.
Yeah.
Oddly. In different ways that in completely different ways than the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is trying its hardest to run from God at the moment, but the founding fathers and the origins of the country are so distinctly Christian that things we would take for granted over there are not even considered here.
You know it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I would assume that's similar in South Africa.
Yeah, certainly. Although I would say South Africa is definitely more, it's a lot more like the U.S. as well.
Yeah.
Some of South Africa's history parallels the U.S.
Okay.
In terms of, a history of Dutch Puritans who had gone down there in the 17th century and really wanting to build something that was distinctly Christian. And you can see that's part of the reason why South Africa is significantly more developed than any other country in Africa. It's because of its Christian heritage.
Yeah.
And so there's also a lot that South Africa as a country has abandoned, unfortunately.
Yeah.
There's a lot that they need to return to in many of its ideals and values. So in that sense, I mean, for sure, and while that's the case, you still do get these pockets of, places and people who are still unacquainted with even some of those historical ideas, and who are in desperate need of the truth.
Yeah.
And really just how to, again, live all of life for the glory of Christ.
Yeah.
And I think if we can enable Christians on this continent to begin to think that way, we would see great transformation.
Yeah.
I think Africa is what it is, not necessarily because the pagans have done their worst, and it's more so that Christians don't know how to do their best, right? And that's something that needs to be remedied for sure.
Yeah. There's a fantastic saying that theology flows out your fingertips.
Absolutely.
And getting that instilled here is something that would be so beneficial.
I agree.
But in that similar vein, how do, when you're, as Africa is becoming more intellectually and intelligently Christian, living out your Christian values, how does it still stay African? How does it not become kind of like the West? And I'm not saying like the West as they're falling, but like how does it not become Western Christianity, but Eastern or Southern Christianity, I guess?
There's a way in which this is a tricky one to answer, and maybe my answer is just going to sound a little bit different. I believe that truth, beauty, and goodness transcend ethnic, national, um, whatever distinctions that we can come up with. What's true in America is also true here.
Yes.
What the standard for beauty is an objective and universal standard.
Yeah.
The standard for goodness is an objective and universal standard.
Yeah. Jackson Pollock does not make good paintings anywhere.
Right. Exactly. In fact, that's exactly it. Pretty spot on. And I think that the emphasis has to be on Christendom.
Yeah.
And building Christ's kingdom in whatever locale we're in, as opposed to merely just trying to preserve a sentimental idea. For example, even just the idea of being African. Like what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Like we'd have to really define what that is. For sure, what Africa needs is not necessarily to be more African, again, whatever that means, but certainly to be more Christian.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the focus needs to be on. And I say that while also believing that there's a lot that we could learn from the Western world as well.
Right.
In terms of just learning from the ideals that made it what it is today.
Right.
Which is why I'm a very big advocate for classical Christian education in Africa.
Yeah.
Because we are engaging with that way of thinking, interacting with the ideas and beliefs that made great civilizations great.
Yeah.
And in learning from those ideals, we can grow too. And we can still grow while still preserving our languages and all that kind of stuff, and learning even what it looks like to exercise dominion for Christ over our use of language, over the propagation of how we use that language to again spread truth, spread beauty, spread goodness in Africa.
Yeah.
So I'd say right now, the emphasis should not be on trying to just preserve some sort of Africanism, but more so the emphasis needs to be on Africa being more Christian.
Yeah. But can you be Christian while still, you can be Christian while still being African, but
certainly.
Can you maintain some of the traditions, not the like, there's gods in the water.
Yeah. Sure.
Right.
Sure.
But can you maintain some of the other traditions? Some of the most beautiful things about countries are, you go to Croatia and church there is wildly different from church in France, and wildly different from church in Brazil.
Certainly.
Right. So and it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Right. Even the way they dress, the way they act, the way they think, is wildly different across those continents, and yet it's still glorifying to God, and it still is true, beautiful, and good.
Absolutely.
Right. So how does Africa kind of maintain their heritage, not in the pagan sense,
sure,
but in the we are proud to be African?
Yeah. I think that's got to, I kind of refer to trying to preserve language, you know, and I think even seeking to do more with language, seeing the things that God has given us as good things that we now need to learn how to steward better. I've used language as an example. There's types of dress that's great. It's beautiful, and is there a way that we can steward that even better? Of course, there's types of dress that is also problematic in Africa, right? And that needs to be done away with. But I think the way to do it is to really see what God has given us as good things that need to be stewarded well, while at the same time fighting off idolatry as and when we see it and wherever we see it.
Right.
God has lavished us with a lot of wonderful things, things that we ought to recognize as things that actually come from Him.
Yeah, behold.
That's right. Things that make us distinct.
Right.
Those things should be appreciated. Those things should be valued. And ultimately submitted to the lordship of Christ.
Yeah. Interesting. No, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, is follow Christ first.
Yeah.
And then, what will pass away,
Yeah.
what should pass away will pass away.
Yeah. I kind of see it. That's, I think that's really where it's got to begin. And I say that because I think even in Africa, there is this idea that several people would have that Christianity is in fact a threat to the preservation of African ideals.
Yeah.
And that's something we need to be starkly aware of.
Yeah.
And while being African and many of the things that he gives to Africa, again, are just incredible things. We have so many things going for us. I mean, even I sometimes think of the communal culture here.
Yeah,
there's a way
so
in which
different from the West.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Of course, there are also ways that it's problematic.
Yes.
Right. But again, that's the importance with beginning with complete submission to the lordship of Christ.
Yeah.
Because that's what's going to enable us to recognize and discern what is good and what is evil, the idols that need to be cut down, and the things that ought to be preserved and stewarded.
Yeah.
That's where everything really does have to begin.
Yeah. No, that's true. And it's been moving from the U.S. has been kind of wild.
Right.
And coming across that
Yeah.
communal in the U.S. and in much of the West, it's I.
Right.
And here it's we.
Sure.
And there are the benefits to that,
Sure.
You're way more communal. You're far. I would guess people here are far less likely to
Right.
be depressed or anxious or things like that, just because they
Right.
have people around them all the time.
Yeah.
But
and at the same time, it's like the other side of it is that the dangers for us to fall into a collectivist mindset.
Yeah.
Which is why Marxism has been such a big thing in this part of the world.
Right.
Because it really does feed into the way people naturally think about things.
Yeah.
And then the other downside of that is people then who don't really understand the importance of assuming personal responsibility.
Yes, that was a big thing.
It becomes then a culture of over dependency, and that's a problem. And so again, it's like being communal, apart from submission to the lordship of Christ, is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I was talking to someone at the college who kind of oversees all the guys' dorms.
Right.
And I was telling him that I live alone and like cook for myself, pay for my groceries, things like that.
Right.
And he was like, "What?"
You're right.
He was like, he told me, he was like, "I wish some of the people here could learn that."
Sure.
But at the same time, I wish that in the U.S. there was a little more of the we're here together.
Absolutely.
We're all in this together,
Absolutely.
as opposed to it's me versus the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and to be fair, I mean, that's not to say you never get communal aspects in the Western world as well.
Yeah, you do.
I've been to Moscow. You guys do pretty well.
Yes. And often around sports is where the big community is found.
Sports, worship.
Yeah.
There's a great festive culture there as well, where people really come together to feast often.
Yeah.
I was fed well in Moscow.
Yes.
But I mean, so it's great to see those kinds of things happening there as well. But I think that, again, is born from a submission to the lordship of Christ that recognizes the importance of being in community with other people,
Right.
And not being isolated.
Yeah.
And so again, like even again, anything that's not submitted to the lordship of Christ is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And whether it's a communal culture, whether it's a more individualistic culture, the standard has to be God's standard, ultimately.
Yeah.
And
Standard is
that
Scripture.
determines even how we ought to relate to one another. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I'd love to see more people from Moscow specifically, but also from all over the U.S. come to Africa. I think that you guys have something here to offer that is deeply needed in the U.S. And we have things to offer that are needed here.
Sure. Absolutely.
But yeah, so in that direction, how do we kind of create more of how do we get more Africans over there and Western people over here?
Oh man, good question. Well, people can apply to the African Christian University.
That's true.
um,
The application process
and
is a ride.
It certainly is. Maybe we could do something with NSA on the other side.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky one in terms of like really forming something like absolutely formal in terms of how we could do that. But I think there's definitely something to be learned from experiencing other contexts.
Yeah.
There's a way in which people can hold to principles that they can only see applied to their own immediate context.
Right.
But when they're in another context, they're stretched to have to think about how those principles would still apply elsewhere if those principles are really anchored in the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone would grow from having those kinds of experiences.
Yeah.
I think we definitely need to see more of that.
Yeah, travel is such a good thing for broadening your perspective on a whole lot of issues.
Yes.
And living in a country is another whole thing entirely.
Yeah, it really is.
Has its pros and cons all over the place.
Yeah.
So, yeah. In Zambia, though, kind of talking about outside influence, there's a big move here by China.
Right.
And that's true actually across Africa.
Sure.
To kind of build everything. To what extent is that good, and to what extent should Zambians be worried about that?
Yeah. I think there's a great extent to which we should be worried about that kind of thing. Because one, that only increases debt. Right. So it's not like the Chinese are working for free.
Nope.
Right. Like,
nope, definitely not.
They want stuff. And this, of course, is also China's attempts to win the economic wars, gain more territory, own more land, and just have more control.
Right.
And before you know it, what then begins to happen as well is that some of the ideas that make China what it is begin to seep in. Case in point, the University of Zambia has, I think, the Confucius Center that's been established now.
Oh, really?
Right, yeah. It's a big thing.
That is not a Zambian thing.
That's not a Zambian thing at all.
Yeah.
It's like pretty much the first thing you see when you drive into the university. And the Chinese built it. It's this, large structure. And so there's already this Eastern mysticism that has already trickled in.
Yeah.
Into Zambia's biggest academic institution.
Yeah.
Right. And like those are some of the consequences of leaving the door wide open to a country like China.
Yeah.
Now, for sure, if there's any positive to it, is that perhaps Zambia has more infrastructure and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I think that is only going to serve to, again, only make the problem of over-dependency that much worse.
Yeah.
Because Zambians never really learned to do things for themselves in that regard.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm also just wary of creating the wrong kinds of alliances,
Yeah. And China needs to do that because China's demographic
absolutely
is the opposite of Zambia.
Exactly.
And they're kind of falling apart fast, and so they either need to
Which is why they're doing what they're doing to a large degree, right?
Yeah.
Like,
you got to either invade or have more kids.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
And then at the same time though, there's an odd mindset here that I was actually talking to some kids at ACU about. In the US, if you want to, and I'm just speaking about the US, I don't know about China. But in the US, if you wanted to go start your own business, right? You start your business, let's say it does okay for a year and then it dies.
Sure.
Right? That would be considered a valuable experience. Here, it doesn't seem, and part of it is like, okay, that didn't work. I can go get a job with these skills that I've learned, and I'll be more useful to that job.
Right.
I can maybe get a little higher salary. Right. There's that safety net economically.
Yeah.
Here, there's not really. And so it's kind of, there's this viewpoint of, I don't want to stretch out my hand because it might get cut off.
Right.
How do you change that? Because that's the kind of thing that would, okay, well, China's building these buildings. Well, I can build them better.
Sure.
And for cheaper.
Sure.
And I'm Zambian, so the government is more likely to hire me.
Yeah.
Right? But that requires like guts, and I'm going to go out there. I'm going to make myself vulnerable.
Yes.
How do you get that? How do you instill that spirit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what you've observed there, if there's one way I'd like sort of summarize it, is the problem of fatalism. Like just this idea that that we're always headed towards doom, generally speaking.
Really?
Yeah. And that sort of applies in many different ways. It's like, why try this if it's gonna fail? Why, and because of that, I think you find a lot of people who just have a risk-averse approach to almost everything.
Right.
I think that's also one of those consequences of, this is gonna be a mouthful, but like a demoralization that comes as a consequence of over-dependency. Even like over.
I can't do it.
Yes, I can't do it.
Yeah.
And even worse so, it's not my responsibility to do it. I think that's even worse.
Yeah.
Which then, coming to the solutions, how do you actually curb that? Well, one, you have to really show people the meaning of true freedom. Like, I think that's actually where it's got to begin.
Yeah.
What is freedom? And of course, I believe that has to begin with teaching them what freedom means in Christ.
Right.
And showing them the implications of that freedom in all of life as well. What does Christ freeing you from your sin free you to do in every other area of life?
Yeah. What does that mean?
What does that mean? And I think that should mean even freedom from the idolatry of having to always depend on the state for everything.
Yeah.
Right? So now you're teaching people the value of personal responsibility.
Right.
Because again, I mean, if people believe that infrastructural development is exclusively the responsibility of the state, people will never assume personal responsibility for that.
No, absolutely.
But if they believe, well, the Lord has freed me to do this, He wants me to exercise dominion right here. This, in fact, is my problem.
Roads need to be built, and
roads
I'm the
need
guy
to be built,
do it.
and I'm the guy to do it. I think that's where it's gotta begin. So you got to teach people freedom. You've got to teach them the value of personal responsibility, and a willingness to learn, and grow in a skill set.
Yeah.
So really, just teaching them the value of competency in that sense.
And to have the mindset not of an employee,
absolutely,
not of a servant or a slave.
Yes.
But like to have the mindset of, I'm the guy that's going to do this.
Exactly.
And I can.
Exactly. One of the reasons why Africa remains poor is because Africa consumes more than it produces.
Yeah.
Right. Now, how do you reverse that? Well, you got to produce.
You got to produce more because you're kind of consuming.
There you go.
The least amount you can.
There you go. And that's because people fundamentally think of themselves as victims, entitled to receiving things.
Interesting. Rather
than considering themselves builders who have the ability to actually produce things and be fruitful in things.
Why is that?
Well, I'd say that's it's sort of layered, but that's kind of what Marxism does to you.
Yeah.
That's
true.
Yeah, and Zambia has that legacy of Marxism. So there are some Zambians who to this day will still blame colonialism, which was overturned 60 years ago.
Yeah.
For some of their perils today. Because you constantly think of yourself as a victim. Well, we're a victim of past Western oppression. We're a victim of this. We're a victim of that.
Right.
And victimhood cripples ingenuity. Victimhood cripples innovation. Victimhood cripples entrepreneurship. It cripples everything. And people who are victims believe that they really can't do anything for themselves. Right?
Yeah.
Like victimhood
fosters... It's a huge thing in the U.S.
Yes. Victimhood fosters entitlement.
Yeah.
And that's never going to build anything.
No.
People are never going to escape their poverty or whatever it is that they're going through. And so you need to teach people that they're not victims.
Yeah.
Again, it kind of goes back to the importance of teaching people freedom and what that means.
Right.
Who are you? Who has God made you to be? You're an image bearer of Christ. As Christians, we understand the freedom that comes from Christ's redemptive work on the cross.
Right.
That then enables us to flourish in every single area of life. But when we perpetually think of ourselves as victims, nothing's ever going to change.
Yeah.
So It's really just trying to teach them those ideals and those virtues.
Right.
Teach them freedom, teach them personal responsibility, teach them competency.
Right.
Teach them ultimately who they are as well in God. It's an identity issue if you really think about it.
Yeah.
People always, what people do is always predicated by who they are.
Right.
Right. Like who we are influences what we do.
Yeah.
And so if people actually understand the implications of being made in the image of God,
we are builders.
We are builders.
We are creators.
We are workers.
We are shapers.
Creators. We are shapers.
Right.
That changes everything.
Yeah.
But when people consistently think of themselves as something other than that, victims or whatever, then that's exactly how they're going to behave. And nothing actually ever gets created. Nothing ever gets done in the way that it's supposed to.
Yeah.
So.
And then 2 questions based off of that. First is, what are practical steps to teach people, like, every day? You're not a victim. You have, to an extent, you have mastery and skill and ability to change and influence your own life kind of where you want it to go. That's a very Western idea. I was listening to, actually, Andrew Tate was saying this, very complicated human. But he was saying, in the U.S., everyone is taught, like, I kind of, like, run my life, and to an extent, I run everything around my life, right? And so I can make myself who I want to be, and that's why we have the Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. We have these incredible entrepreneurs because they were like, all right, I'm in charge. I can take control over my life and shift it and move it to become whatever I want it to be, and that's possible.
Yeah.
And that's why he was saying you can tell who an American is just by their walk and how they hold themselves. Because it's like, look at me. Yeah. I'm not like a worker.
Sure.
I'm a builder. Sure. I'm a shaper. Right.
Sure.
I'm to an extent, I'm a king.
Right.
And that's a very American mentality.
Yeah.
How do we kind of get, I mean, I'm not saying that is where we need to be with Zambia, but how do we kind of get to practically that viewpoint of, I can, to an extent, move my life. I can direct my life and take it there by hard work and diligence and creativity.
Yeah. There's a lot of layers to this. Again, like people, that's anchored in what people believe about themselves. That's anchored in what people believe to be true.
Yeah.
And so you actually have to acquaint them with the truth. You have to challenge their false worldviews with a right worldview, with a right and proper worldview.
Yeah.
And so teaching is going to be crucial.
Yeah.
Hence the importance for Christian academic institutions.
Right.
Hence the importance of just Christian institutions as a whole. I think Christians need to be the ones leading the charge on this. Not just in telling people the truth, but in also showing them how it's done.
Yeah.
Like when people see you living with a sense of freedom, they're prompted to ask, why do you live the way that you live?
And pride to an extent. Yeah.
And then therein lies that opportunity again for us to give that reason for what we believe.
Yeah.
Because they actually see how we're living our lives.
Yeah.
It's like, why don't you act scared? Why do you take risks? Why are you so okay with going against the grain of the culture? Why are you, there's all these questions that they would ask just from them observing someone who lives like a free person, like a free man. And therein lies the opportunity. So I think there's got to be a lot of teaching that's done, but I think that also it would go a long way for that to be modeled for them as well.
Yeah.
And them actually seeing people who exemplify what it means to live in freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that there's there's probably so much more to this as well. But I mean, another way I can just encompass it is you need to create this culture of discipleship as a whole, and really teaching people what it means to live in the freedom of Christ and to glorify Him in all things.
Yeah.
Right? Like it, I think very much so. The Great Commission is a commission about discipling the nations, teaching them teaching them freedom,
Right.
by teaching them the law,
Right.
and in teaching them that freedom, teaching them really how to flourish.
Yeah.
Teaching them how to take responsibility for themselves. Not merely just giving them handouts and doing everything for them, but actually teaching them how to, like, this is what your hands are for.
Yeah.
And so really just forming the way what people believe about themselves.
Yeah.
That enables them to then act in accordance with now what they know to be true.
Yeah.
If I'm not just this guy who exists to merely survive.
Right.
And I'm actually a guy who's built to, or created to actually build stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that changes what I do with my hands.
Right.
That changes what I do with everything that's around
How you
me.
think.
How you think.
Yeah.
How you relate to people. You name it.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's ultimately the first thing that people need for sure is the truth of all that.
Yeah.
We are creatures who always function in relation to what we believe to be true. Like
Right.
we're creatures who always function in accordance with revelation, whether that's false or true. Revelation. We always function on the basis of what we're informed by.
Yeah.
And I think if we can acquaint people with truth, that goes a long way in freeing them from thinking in destructive ways, and actually going on and thinking of themselves as builders of glorious things.
Yeah. Yeah. The so you're saying showing them not only by doing it yourself, of go out there and take risks,
Right.
but also having them. We have the SLP student
Sure.
labor program
Sure.
at ACU,
Yeah.
having them head that up of like, look here, you can make this place look excellent, and it is something that is glorious and good.
Absolutely.
And is something that brings God glory.
Exactly.
That's the kind of thing that God really truly finds pleasure in.
Absolutely. And be reminded that you were created for this.
Yeah.
Like, this is not
Right.
just like some cool idea out
Yeah.
there. Like,
We are to shape the garden.
absolutely.
Yeah.
This is
And
what you
we're
were
not
created
just to
for.
live in it.
Exactly.
We're to tend it. And
Exactly.
yeah. And
I think, this is probably worth mentioning as well. Sorry to jump the gun there.
no, go ahead.
But I think just also showing people the implications and applications of salvation in a way that goes beyond, like, freedom is not just about freedom from sin. It's freedom to then go and create and build as well.
Yeah.
It's not enough to simply be saved. It's not enough to simply have your ticket punched to heaven.
Right.
It's important that you understand that all of life
Yeah.
belongs to Christ, and you are to work, build, create, all that stuff in every single area
Yeah.
of life.
Yeah.
And really just showing them, because again, that kind of goes back to what Christ has accomplished for you is not a small thing.
No.
Right? Like
No.
this is not just about transforming your heart. Like, his transformation is the kind of transformation that actually transforms the world.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and if you believe that, then
Yeah.
then you understand that you have a significant calling
Yeah.
to then go and do what you've been called to do in every area.
Yeah, there's an excellent verse, I think, in Matthew or
Yeah.
maybe in Luke, to whom much is given, much is required.
That's right.
That's the kind of thing, and as you said, Christ's salvation is that's the much.
Yes.
That's like, it doesn't
Yes.
matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you are.
Right.
That is the much
Absolutely.
that you have been given, and now much is required.
Yes.
It is not your job to
Yes.
sit around and wait
Right.
for Christ to change the world.
Right.
You need to go, therefore, and disciple the nations.
Right.
And to what extent is that? Because in the U.S. there's also a lot of we're kind of actually seeing a shift away from it, which is fantastic. But there's a lot of the dependency on government.
Oh yeah.
How much of that here is, because in the U.S. that's almost exclusively laziness.
Yeah.
How much of that here is laziness, and how much is victim mentality of I'm working hard, but I
Yeah.
just don't think I can.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot of both.
Okay.
It's hard for me to sort of split hairs on it. Laziness for sure is a thing. There's also a sense in which that over dependency produces laziness.
Yeah.
So in a sense, there are people who don't even recognize that it's laziness. It's like,
Yeah.
I worked hard to vote.
Yeah.
So why isn't the government doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
I'd say fundamentally so. Zambia and many other countries have a history of socialism. A history of having to depend on the government for everything, which explains why taxes are so high, which explains why the justice system is so inefficient. Which,
Right.
It explains a lot of the vices that we see around us, and a lot of it is just premised on over dependency, on the government doing everything for you. Like, that's sort of the expectation here, and it's not so much that I think people just don't want to work.
Right.
In that sense, I think it's even just more so that they don't know that they can. Right.
Oh, interesting.
Because the government does everything for them.
Oh.
Like for example, I think there are some people who can't even fathom educating their own kids, or just assuming responsibility for the education of their
Right.
own kids, because that's just something that they've always believed that the government does for you.
Yeah.
That
makes sense of the crazy high unemployment rate.
Yes, absolutely. Crazy high unemployment rate, but then also, like, I think it's over 70% of working people in Zambia are employed by the government as well, right? Like, so, right? Like, all right, like, how's that for over dependency, right?
Yeah.
Which means then the brunt of course, like, those who would work for private corporations and so on, like, they would take the brunt of tax and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
As well.
Oh yeah.
So it's very difficult to thrive and progress.
To
with all
be
those
independent.
things. Like, to be independent. Like, there's so many things that are almost designed to prevent you from being independent and flourish.
Yeah.
Which is why there's a lot that needs to change in terms of what the culture values in that sense. So that's something that people need to escape. Social welfare is a problem, and you see that here in so many ways. Inflation is always growing. I think just in the time you've been here.
Yes. My
stuff has gotten more
landlord
expensive.
keeps posting the U.S. to Zambia currency exchange rate.
Yeah, there we go. National debt is just.
I saw that Zambia borrowed another $270 million the other day.
Yeah, and it's quite ridiculous. Like, it's bad. Per capita income, Zambia is actually listed among some of the poorest countries in the world on that metric. I think a lot of that is literally the consequence of being over dependent on the government.
Right.
That's what socialism or social welfare. It's the same thing. That's what it produces. It produces poverty. It produces a populace that are essentially neutered. Another thing is that it produces an effeminate culture.
Yeah, they're trying to make that in the U.S.
Absolutely.
We're working on fighting that back.
Where men don't understand their ability to be builders, to be providers,
to carry women's chairs and help them with dinner.
There you go. Because the expectation again is for the government to do everything.
Yeah.
Like, it's the government that looks after people's families, that looks after men's families, rather than men actually
taking care of their own family. Yeah.
And that just becomes like the norm in the culture. So it's a long answer, and there's a lot to change. And in fact, but I mean, on that point, like, I think one of the ways to actually, like, fight against that stuff, like, if you want to fight tyranny, build strong and virtuous men.
Yes.
Right? Like if you can win over the men, you can win over the
especially
culture.
the young men. I mean, that's why they've been targeted so much.
Especially the young men.
TikTok, the effeminate guys are the ones that do well, and that is for a reason. Like Andrew Tate, for all of his, he has a lot of bad qualities, right? He's got a whole lot wrong with him. There's a lot of darkness, but the fact that he is strong, he is independent, he is wealthy, and he is not afraid to say what he believes, even in the face of jail and persecution and potential death.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing that attracts young men. and there's, and that's the kind of thing that Christians should be doing.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest pet peeves I have is like the Christian men seem to be all the ones that are sitting in the library with their books doing nothing.
Right.
It's like, where are the strong Christian men who are out there leading the charge?
And I think that's because
getting shot.
Exactly.
Right.
Because somewhere we believe that like the sum of masculinity was like being nice.
Somehow we went wrong.
Somehow we went wrong, and unfortunately, some people even tried to Christianize that, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But for sure, if you can win over the young men, especially, that's how you win. But then, that's also a big fight,
Huge fight.
You've got to. There are things that are specifically targeted towards young men to weaken them.
Mm-hmm.
Things like pornography.
Right.
Things like college.
Yep. Yep.
Things like youth groups.
Yeah.
There's a plethora of things, right?
Right.
Like things that actually perpetuate the immaturity of young men.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be thinking how really, truly we ought, how we can be forging strong, godly, virtuous men who are
with a backbone.
With a backbone. They have conviction and they have courage and they are willing to die building and preserving what is true, what is beautiful, and what's good.
Yeah.
We need that. That's any tyrant's worst nightmare. Is a man who wakes up and is free and understands his calling and his duty.
Yeah.
And
is free to think and is free to act on his thoughts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and is free to deny himself his own thoughts.
Yes, precisely.
Which is it's such a fought over battle at the moment that needs to be won, and I think that I think actually that Africa has a better has a more of an opportunity to be that because of the as you shift further and further away from the comforts of the world and back into the survive or die.
Right.
Not only do gender roles, you have the man who brings home the food and the woman who takes care, of the home and builds it and makes it beautiful, but also the men are stronger men because they're just they have to be. They're survivors.
Yes. Right?
And that's not a thing we have in the US.
Yes.
One of the most interesting things I saw the other day was there's a picture of the average it was like 10 high schoolers graduating today.
Yeah.
10 high school boys and then 10 high school boys graduating in like the 1950s.
Sure.
And they look like 25-year-olds.
There you go.
And it's because they weren't reliant on everyone and everything
exactly
to make their lives go round. They weren't effeminate men.
Yes.
And the 1950s had problems.
That's right.
But the men were men.
Sure.
And getting back to that would be a fantastic start.
Absolutely.
In denying tyranny, but also in building Zambia.
In building Zambia. In fact, that's the thing. Like masculinity, understood this way, would solve most of the world's
problems.
Like so many problems.
So many.
A lot of what we're seeing is because it's a consequence of effeminacy, fatherlessness, like you name it. Like it's problems with men,
Yeah.
And I think that if we can build, again, strong and virtuous men, we're gonna turn the tide of darkness even on this continent.
Yeah. Read your Bible, pray, go to church, exercise your mind, body, and soul, and
take a wife, love her.
Yeah.
Have kids, raise them to fear God. Work hard, be fruitful in all your endeavors.
Take one woman.
One woman.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Take one woman. And
that's right.
Be chaste before her.
Yes.
There's so much opportunity in this moment for guys for men who are men.
Yes.
The world is your oyster.
Absolutely.
Every step of the way is your oyster.
Yep.
If you can just put your head down and be, as Dana White says, and be a savage.
Absolutely.
The savages will win.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
thank you again for coming on. Where should people
This has been
find you on the internet? And
Yes, I'm on Substack, where if that's probably where I write most of my work these days. So Lennox Kalifungwa, .substack.com. I'm also probably most active on Twitter. So you can look for me on Twitter. Just look for my name, Lennox Kalifungwa. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one that'll pop up.
Yes. I took a quick look, and there's not many Lennox Kalifungwas.
Absolutely. So you could find me there. Sure, I'm on Facebook, sure I'm on Instagram, but Twitter is probably like the social media platform I use the most.
Thank you, Elon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Elon.
Great, and I'll
well,
put
if you
all
don't
those...
know, we're from the same city.
Oh yeah, you are.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah.
Like there you go.
I'm just conveniently sliding that in there.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, Elon, if you ever come to Zambia, you've got a native friend for you. Thank you again for coming on. I will put those links in the description. This has been fantastic. See you guys. Add a little